Despite their white skin color, the Irish are an example of a group subject to racism. Mary Hickman.
Hello, my name is Rita, and I'm here today to speak about an unexposed minority, the Irish population in Britain. So let's get started.
The Irish are still a largely invisible society in terms of an ethnic group in Britain. They continue to be racialized as inferior. Sociologists ruled out the Irish from being considered due to the unexpressed support for the myth of homogeneity of whites in Britain. Having the historical background behind Ireland and Britain into consideration, one is familiar with settling religious and later social conflicts. Since the Celts up until today, Ireland and Britain take different positions. So, passing through the Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, William the Conqueror, Henry VIII, Oliver Cromwell, up to the partitioning of Ireland, these two were in constant disagreement, and things are still not firm. All these events had their importance when the topic is minority. The Irish became a minority in Britain, but for too long, an unexposed one.
So let's start with all the people that invaded Britain and Ireland for some reason. So the Celts inhabited Britain and Ireland. Then the Roman Empire, which promoted Catholic religion and Jesus. Then they fall, and the Anglo-Saxons made England Germanic, which shook the waters. Well, after that, the Vikings passed but destroyed both islands. Then the Normans came along with William the Conqueror and invaded both Ireland and England. But the Irish never minded that much because eventually their lords became increasingly powerful. And so Henry VIII came to disrupt this power. He dissolved almost every church and proceeded with the Protestant Reformation, and also with the plantations, the Ulster plantations. The Ulster plantations were a phenomenon where the English hastily prompted this policy in which loads of Scottish and English Protestants took hold of the available land from the vulnerable and depleted Catholics. This animosity led to bloody and not to be forgotten riots. Moreover, English language became the language of power in north of Ireland, and the Gaelic language lost its power. It was then created a minority of Protestants in Ireland, and, the discrimination of the Catholics became outrageous. They were heavily discriminated and oppressed. So most of them remained poor, whereas Protestants were getting on with their lives. So eventually Northern Ireland joined the United Kingdom, and Catholics demanded equal rights. But in the middle of this all, the Great Famine took place in Ireland, and the nation needed help from whom? From Britain. So their population was starving and they needed conditions. The British population, they helped them in a way. But then the British government responded poorly to the disaster, and it led to many rebellions. The majority of Irish people began to be nationalistic, poor, agrarian, but still Catholic. So this episode had huge impact on Ireland's demography. It is assumed that around 1 million Irish people died, and the remnant of people emigrated to escape scarcity and to prevent the starvation to death, really. The majority of Irish left, right? Where to? North America and, guess what? Great Britain. So Ireland could not stand on its feet and live attached to a party that was not helping in any way. So Ireland partitioned, and it was a rough moment for this nation since it split into two different countries. The one who wanted to be independent from the people who discriminated their social, religious, and cultural habits, and the one who were Protestant and so did wanted to be part of the United Kingdom. Nowadays, due to this historical background, the Irish see the British as snobbish and as the people who ruined the Irish race. The Irish still feel inferior to the British when living in Britain.
Irish immigrants in the late 19th century were sensed as one of the main target population of British colonial enslavement and other forms of racial discrimination. Mary Hickman, a researcher, in her book Religion, Class and Identity, claimed that colonial racism was crucial to the British Protestants and contributed to the experience of the Irish population in Britain. Within the historical background, topics that inspected the convolutions of the processes of the racialization of the Irish immigrants and of the labor migrants focused upon concerns related to British imperialism, to the mass immigration that Britain received, and racial discrimination from Britain's part. Industrialization in Britain brought many changes in being Britain a capitalist society, connected this with its imperialist project. Greater structural changes in the world economy took place and stimulated the demand for migrant labor. So Irish immigrants were of major importance in terms of both economic and cultural ways to this project. The Irish contributed to the British capitalism and provided Britain with evolution by working as coal miners, in factories, in cotton mills, in agriculture, doing domestic work, house building, navigating, etc. The fact that racism was abbreviated to color racism inherently brought the denial of the existence of anti-Irish racism. The Irish were then culturally invisible and became Britain's major immigrant and ethnic minority. At the same time, religion, or more specifically Catholicism, has been of central importance, historically and presently, to the internal organization of Irish life in Britain and the development of their collective identity. There came up some arguments in order to deracialize the Irish population living in Britain, to disrupt the idea that the Irish suffer from racism in Britain. One of the main arguments is the historical phenomenon, which refers to the term racism as not being suitable for the situation, since in this Irish-British context, the term racism is only used from 1940 onwards. So instead, the term used is prejudice, anti-Irish prejudice. Another premise is that just as the Jew community, the Irish community has experienced institutional discrimination throughout time. Yet, that it never resulted in racialization adversities, at least not equivalent to the experience of the new Commonwealth immigrants.
Concerning the Irish view on ethnicity, they see themselves as different. They do not feel formally recognized, and this difference could be witnessed on the 2001 British census. This resulted on a proposal to have a white section when considering ethnicity, enabling the population to identify themselves as Irish or other. Ethnic identification was only at issue when one did not feel like belonging to a group of people. Anti-Irish racism in Britain made the Irish vulnerable. It turned them into a minority. Due to the negative experiences, people start to oppress themselves to avoid being discriminated. The Commission of Racial Equality, on the behalf of the Irish, occasionally selected a sample drawn on the basis of their names in the electoral register and conducted a survey, in which they questioned whether the Irish should or not be considered an ethnic group in Britain. The majority answered favorably, but many answered oppositely, and others were just uncertain. Most of these undecided people were living in London, by the way. Well, the Irish statistical invisibility in Britain. Well, that's important. When an academic wanted to assess the impact of the Irish population in Britain, well, it got complicated because the Irish population were mostly absent on the British Census 2001. So, in the census, people expressed their community size, their needs, their specific locations, etc. So, this led to the Irish community to organize and to fight for inclusion. Many of the Irish communities had to approach the Office National Statistics in order to be included, at least as an ethnic minority, or to even have an Irish category on the following census, but they needed to feel included. The fact that the Irish population was being omitted on statistics was sort of showing that they did not exist in Britain, when in fact they did, and they have always contributed to what we can call Britain today.
It is immoral to neglect, to oppress, or to exclude others just to emerge. In order to possess a homogeneous society, the dominant group must have in mind the other's needs, being the others any minority of any kind. In fact, it is part of being a host or a good host, a proper host, to consider others' necessities. So Britain throughout time has shown that the Irish population is not part of their group and that they prefer to keep their social distance. So the British supremacy was and will always be remembered as the politest and will always be looked up to by many societies. When one thinks about a polite society, the first one that comes to mind is the British, am I right? Nonetheless, going through the historical and current backgrounds, current facts, historical facts, the British ignored the Irish well-being. They were part of their country, contributed to their nation, so it gets a bit controversial to mention politeness, don't you think? When thinking about Britain and Ireland and the British society and the Irish society living in Britain, we must consider racism. Not color, skin racism, but racism, discrimination, prejudice, all of that is racism. By not giving them the social conditions that they need, by not giving them the health conditions that they need, the education that they need, by employing them on the workforce of handmade jobs, of manual jobs, by affecting all of their lives and not giving a crap. So I think that racism exists in Britain, and it is not only against black people or whatever. I think that racism against Irish is real and that the anti-racism campaigns must continue so that British people must acknowledge that British and Irish are contributing to the British nation. They were always contributing to the nation. It's not from now, and it is quite rare when one thinks about, for example, the building of the City of London. Who did it? The Irish did it. So bear in mind that racism is not only about skin color, and you might expose this minority and the racism that they suffer in Britain.
Guruma Agat. Thank you.